this morning as well. But then I thought, wait, the heat will be on at church. So here I am. No. It's always good to be with the folks that we love here in the faith. And I know that you all feel the same way, as do the people who could not be with us here this morning. So you're seeing something here that's kind of new for me, because the time that I would have used to write down the notes or type them up for this morning's sermon was given to taking care of little Ron while Julie was with Elizabeth at the emergency room. And then later on, when there was no power to write or to see, I thought, well, we'll just take the word into the pulpit and speak from the heart. But that's a new thing for me. So it's kind of like playing by ear when there's no music in front of you. Last week, you remember, we looked at the story of Jonah. And we talked about how he had been given this specific call from the Lord to go and preach to the city of Nineveh. The call was explicit, not just to go, but also to preach. And then the message itself was given to Jonah. He didn't have to worry about what he was going to say. God said, just tell them, in 40 days the city will be destroyed. So Jonah had a clear understanding of what he was supposed to do and what he was supposed to say. And then we remember the story of he tried to get away from that and elude God, and in the end he did exactly what God wanted him to do, even though he didn't like it very much, even at the end. And then I said we'd look again at what it means to be called by God and to discern His will. And I thought, I think I'll give a title to today's message. It's really original, Discerning the Will of God. But I don't normally do that, because it's been my experience that often I'll be sitting out here in the congregation during a sermon, and perhaps the preacher is delivering a message on a specific topic, but the scripture that's being used will begin to say something different to me, not in disagreement with what's being preached, but just something that wasn't being emphasized. So I've always been a little hesitant to put a title on the sermon, because I feel like that's sort of putting a focus, a lens on our eyeglasses before we even get a chance to look at it together. And maybe the Spirit will say something different to you than He has to me as we look together and share these words. But we're going to go to Matthew in the New Testament, chapter 14. Now, I'm pretty traditional when it comes to preaching, so ordinarily I would be up there. But also, when there's a small crowd, like if I've got a choir rehearsal and there's just a few people, I'll always tell them, why don't you come and gather around the piano so we can all be closer. But I knew that if I asked all you folks to just move closer, that may or may not happen. So I thought it would be easier for me to just come to you. Can you all hear me okay? We'll see if the voice lasts the whole time. I see, we've got lots of time this morning. We're in good shape. Matthew 14. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but we are going to kind of outline and summarize. So starting at the beginning, the circumstances here are Herod, who was currently the sort of king, sort of governor there in Israel. He's had an affair with his sister-in-law, and they've gotten together. Wrong on several different levels. And because he's done this, John the Baptist, and you remember, John the Baptist has been active preaching even before Jesus showed up, saying to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is coming. One greater than me is coming. John's been preaching. And when Herod does this thing, he speaks out against the immorality of Herod. Imagine what that must be, to speak out against the immorality of those in positions of authority. You can think about that all you like. it does strike me as odd that many in the church seem to have abandoned that perspective. But be that as it may, John the Baptist speaks out against this immorality of Herod, and consequently, Herod goes after him, puts him in prison. And so Herod has John in prison to keep him quiet, but the sister-in-law that is now with him as his wife, she's carrying a grudge. And so it comes time that they have this party. It's a big feast. And there's another player here, Salome, and she's the daughter of the Herodias, the sister-in-law. And so Herod asks her to dance for the party. And this would not be like a nice solo dance from a ballet. This would be more like something that might be seen in, remember the business up by Plainfield? I think it's changed, but it would be more like that kind of a dance. And so Salome has been approached by her mother, and she's been told, if he asks you to dance, tell him that you'll do it, but that you want the head of John the Baptist on platter. So, and Herod had indeed said, I'll give you whatever you want, whatever you ask for, if you dance for us. And so Salome does this thing, and John the Baptist is killed, and the head is presented just the way that it was promised. And you know, you think about Herod. He wasn't of a mind to kill John the Baptist, probably because he thought that if I kill him, I'll make his message even stronger. So I'll just keep him in prison where he can't be a problem for me. But then, because he was in this party, surrounded by these guests, and he made this promise publicly, he sort of felt like he was pressured to follow through with the commitment. And that made me think of the times that I myself have done this, and I've seen other people do it as well, that when in a group of people, you sometimes do things that you might not do if you weren't in that group. Am I right? And that doesn't necessarily mean bad things, but we sort of feel a compulsion when we're with the spirit that forms when a group of people get together. There was once that I went with my brothers-in-law to the swimming pool at McCormick's Creek State Park. And this was many years ago when they still had a 25-foot diving board. Some of you remember that, the high diving board? And I'd never been off a diving board in my life. I took swimming lessons when I was a kid. And when it came time to jump off of the low board at the Forest Park pool, the big round one, I just wouldn't do it. I just sat there. Well, you know, my brothers-in-law, they were jumping off the low board, they were jumping off the high board. They weren't really pressuring me, but they did say, you know, why don't you go off? And I said, nope, I haven't done it, I'm not going to start today. Well, they got out of the pool and went over to the concession stand, and I thought to myself, well, why not? So I went over, and I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I might as well go for the big one, right? So I climbed up to 25 feet and went off the board, no big deal. But I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been in those circumstances. And incidentally, that's the only time I've ever been off the diving board. And it wasn't even scary. It's just something, you know, I don't need to do that. That's not the thing I would choose to do. Just like when I listen to music, I don't turn on certain stations. But there's this thing that happens to us when we get with a group. And it can be a small group, it can be, sometimes in a big group, it can really take over. And we've seen that in scriptural examples. You think about the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai. when they decided that they couldn't wait on Moses to get back. They needed to do something now. And they had Aaron build the idol for them. You know, you don't just melt down gold and form an idol out of it in 15 minutes. This was a controlling idea and spirit that they took part in over quite a period of time. You know, sometimes we see that happening in our society too. And with the rise of social media, where ideas and statements can be put forth just like that, you can see these kinds of ideas sort of take root and move through a society in a big way. And how troubling is it then when we learn that many of these ideas and statements and so-called facts aren't even real? They've been put out there by some group off in another country to change our way of interacting with each other. It's a scary thing when you think about it. Even scarier is that so many seem to just sort of discount that as not really something that's too important to think about. But there's power in numbers, and that's what happens to Herod. He probably didn't want to kill John the Baptist. But because he was constrained by making the promise in front of these people that were sort of on the same level as himself, nobles and wealthy people, he thought, well, I've got to follow through, otherwise I'm going to look bad. And so he does that. Now, sometime after all of these events have taken place, and by some time I mean a day or two, he makes the statement that when he hears about Jesus preaching and working miracles out in the countryside, he thinks, this must be John the Baptist returned from the dead, or the spirit of John rising up against me and this other person. And then when Jesus hears word of that, if we go down to verse 13, we learn that when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. But then, upon hearing about Jesus leaving and going off by himself, they followed him on foot from the towns of that area. And so they were there waiting for him when he got out of the boat. And when he gets out of the boat, rather than try to slip away and follow through with his original intent, it says he had compassion on the crowd and began to minister to them. It says he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, apparently this would have happened in the late morning, early afternoon, because it says, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, you know, we're out in the middle of nowhere, basically. And it's getting late, and people are going to be hungry. So let's send them home so that they can get something to eat. And Jesus says, well, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Well, bring them here to me, Jesus says. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Well, it was nice of the writer to put besides women and children, at least they're mentioned, huh? But the official census only counted the men, 5,000. But there might have been as many as 10, 15, even 20,000 people present at this gathering. And it says they all ate and were satisfied. A miracle of creation? Possibly. Possibly. A miracle of compassion that Jesus' presence and love and ministry prompted the people to bring out the food they had brought with them and share with everyone. Maybe it was some of that too. Certainly, the God of heaven and earth could do anything that he wants. But I like to think that there was more than just simply the manifestation of miraculous bread and fish. I mean, I carry food with me where I go because I don't like to eat the food that I get from places. And if my daughter knows that I have something, and she says, hey, can I have some of that? My first inclination is to be, no, you bring your own food. So I'm wondering if there wasn't some of that going on here as well, but that in a different way, actually, then that evil kind of intent took over the crowd of partiers with Herod. Here, the Spirit of God was at work and opened the hearts of these people to share what they had with each other. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but I like to think that there was an element of that at work. And perhaps Jesus, in whatever lack was left over, used the miraculous power to bring forth more food as needed. And then, interesting, isn't it? There were 12 baskets full left over at the end. How many disciples were there? Okay, so then it says, verse 22 here, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. So what's going on there? Immediately. You remember where Jesus has ministered to crowds before, and they want to make him a king, and they want to rally to his cause, and really just kind of move with this force of numbers to have an uprising. I think that he was mindful of that and did not want that kind of idea to start spreading. Because here the people had experienced his ministry for hours, his teaching, his caring for the sick, his healing, and now this miraculous bounty of food. He didn't want that to turn into something political. So he tells the disciples, you go on ahead. You remember, he was looking for time alone before all of this started. You go on ahead, cross over to the other side, and I'm going to dismiss the crowd and spend some time alone in prayer. And, you know, in the words of the song that we sang earlier, it said the Galilean lake. We call it the Sea of Galilee, but from what I read, it's only about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide at the widest point. So it's more like a big lake than a sea, and not all that deep like we think of the ocean. But in any case, the disciples do what he says. They get in the boat and they make their way toward the other side. And then Jesus goes up into the hillside alone to pray. So let's pick up the narrative at verse 23. After he had dismissed them, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. I'm just going to comment right here. Another fact about this particular body of water was that because it was low and there was some high ground around it, cold air that would come down and mix with the warm air from the lake would sometimes cause these little squalls to come up. So this was a common thing on the Sea of Galilee. During the fourth watch of the night, now the fourth watch translates into like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's the time frame we're talking about here. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now this is one of those little scenes that we talk so much about in Vacation Bible School or Sunday school or children's church. And we all remember the story and the moral of the story. But there might be some things here that we missed. Let's look at that again. Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Now, you know, I always sort of had the idea that they were upset and worried because of the storm. That's not what it says. It says, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It was the sight of Jesus himself that caused the disciples to be afraid. And as I thought about that, I realized, well, if these storms were sort of a common thing, they were no strangers to this part of the world. They were probably dealing with the circumstances just fine. Sure, it was a hard thing to row the boat against the wind and the waves and the current. It was all a struggle, but it was something that they had encountered before, and they knew how to deal with it. How many of you ever pulled into a parking place, and at the very moment that your vehicle stops, the person next to you starts to back out, and you have a moment of, I think it was like that, where it was something that was so unexpected that they would see him walking on the water. Oh, and they're like halfway across the lake at this point. I don't believe our text tells us that, but if we look at the same story in Mark or in John, because it's told in those two places as well, in one of those places, it tells us that they're about halfway across. So imagine they're about 3.5 miles from the shore, and they see Jesus walking toward them. And when they saw him, that's when they have the fear. They cry out, and then Jesus immediately reassures them. He says, "Don't worry, it's just me." And you know, verse 28 is my favorite verse in this whole passage. And when I was a kid, didn't think anything about it. I was probably 25, 26 years old when I read this verse. You know, I think it was Kellogg's cornflakes. They said in the commercial, "Taste them again for the first time." It was like, here, I read this verse again for the first time. Look at what it said. "If it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." Peter has this moment where he's not sure that it's Jesus, but he thinks that it is. I mean, it says in the verses before that they saw Jesus coming to them. They were afraid, but I think they suspected that it was him. And so Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Now, don't we sort of have the idea that if we test God, we're doing something wrong? That if we ask for further proof, we're somehow short of faith. So wouldn't we expect Jesus to sort of chide Peter for asking such a question? Or even to rebuke him for asking such a question? But he doesn't, does he? He just says, "Come." And I thought, that's like the most beautiful piece of truth in this whole story. When you aren't sure if it's Jesus coming to you, just ask him. And he will not be upset by that. And then we see what happens. Jesus says, "Come." And I suspect that Jesus knew what was going to happen, right? He had to know, Peter's not ready for this. He's going to come a few steps, and then he's probably going to sing. But he says, "Come." You ever tried to teach a a young child to ride a bicycle? They're ready to do it. You know it may not be time yet, but you have to just let them go and encourage them, right? If we're that way with our own children, how much more is God with us? When we may not be fully ready, but yet our childlike faith is prompting us to go ahead, He supports us in those endeavors. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water to Jesus. And I think, isn't this an interesting contrast? Earlier, they had the wind, they had the waves, and they were making it just fine. They were working against it. It was hard work, but wasn't anything unusual, wasn't anything they hadn't dealt with before. And when they see Jesus, they're afraid. But now, he steps out of the boat, he sees Jesus, and then he starts looking at the wind and the water, and he thinks, wait, what's happening here? And so it's kind of an interesting turnabout there, that now he's going to be afraid. And this also is beautiful, isn't it? He cries out, Lord, save me, and Jesus takes his hand and helps him, and they get into the boat. So, I mean, there are all kinds of lessons there. I don't need to point them out, because I suspect that you see them. We can ask Jesus if it's really him. We can step out in faith. And if we get in trouble after we step out in faith and everything seems to be going okay, we can trust him to help us when we fall. I don't think when Jesus says, you have little faith, why did you doubt? I don't think that that's spoken like this. You have little faith. Why did you doubt? I don't think that was his spirit at all. I think it was a more gentle spirit and one just trying to remind Peter, what are the possibilities when you are in the will of God and doing what I'm asking? And it says, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, there are a couple of things here in this passage that I want us to catch. Look back in verse 27. Jesus says two things to them after they see him and they feel the fear. He first of all encourages them and tells them not to be afraid. But the other thing he says to them is, it is I. Do you remember what God says to Moses in response to the question when Moses asks God, who shall I say sent me? What did God say to him? You tell them that I am sent you. And so, I am is the most fundamental name of God, and Jesus is saying that same thing here. It is I. Don't be afraid. And along with that thought, come down now to the last verse that we read. Verse 33. Those who were in the boat worshipped him and said, truly, you are the Son of God. They worshipped him. What did Jesus tell the devil when he was tempted in the wilderness? You shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So if you needed any further proof that Jesus truly is the Son of God, and that being said, part of God himself, right here is proof. He identifies himself, it is I. And then he does not rebuke the disciples when they worship him. He accepts that. I read a couple of articles this week saying that it was like 87% of, and they use this term, I'm not entirely sure what it means, but I feel like I'm in that number. Some 87% of evangelical Christians don't know their basic doctrine. This is one of those things. A lot of those people, when asked, they believe that Jesus is the first thing that God created back in the beginning. That's not true. Jesus is not the first thing that God created. That's an ancient heresy that arose in the 4th century by a man named Arius. What we believe is that Jesus is God. When John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," that's Jesus. And the Holy Spirit flowing from the Father and the Son also is God. Do we understand it? No. Not on a rational level. We don't. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. We sing about Him every Sunday after we take up the offering. Sometimes it comes at the end of a hymn, too. That's God. Jesus accepts their worship, which again confirms that. So, of all of the lessons that we can take away, what are some of the big ones? First of all, I think we need to remember that there is power in numbers. Power for good, power for evil. And we need to be mindful of that. We need to be ready to resist it. We need to be ready to maybe speak about it. And I've talked about that before. We can be in a group. Certain ideas can begin to be spoken about. Ideas that are not really Christian at all, though they may say that they are. How many times have we kept silent, thinking, well, I don't believe that way, I don't think that's right, but I don't want to cause trouble here. I think that the time for silence is getting further and further behind us. Power in numbers. There's another lesson here, the power in solitude. That one's not talked about quite so much. But we have the example of Jesus, who wanted to be alone at the beginning of the story, to find time for prayer and communion with God. And when the opportunity for ministry came, he took up that call and ministered to the crowd, but then he dismissed them and went off by himself. He separated himself not just from the people to whom he was ministering, he also separated himself from his close-knit community of followers, just to be alone with God. And we need that time as well. And then there's the lesson of the disciples in the boat, doing exactly what Jesus had told them to do. Working hard at what Jesus told them to do, crossing the lake. And it was in the midst of these circumstances, where they were completely in the will of God, doing exactly what they'd been commanded to do, working hard at it. It was in these circumstances that Jesus appeared to them, causing them to be afraid. And I think that we need to be ready for that as well. That in the midst of carrying out the Lord's work, we may be surprised by a sudden realization of His very presence. I'm not sure that we can escape the being afraid part. Because I think that, again, it's like that moment that you pull into the parking space and the people next to you pull out right at the same time and you think something's wrong. I think we're bound to feel that jolt when something like this happens. But then it shouldn't be entirely unexpected from the lesson here. Then the beautiful lesson in verse 28. If you're not sure, just ask, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you. And He will. And then if things go haywire, we don't have to be afraid then either. Just ask Him to help. And then, of course, the last one. Remember who Jesus is. The Son of God. God Himself. The one about, Paul says, your hope, meaning you followers of Jesus, your hope is Christ in you, making you a new creature. The old passes away, the new has come. The resurrection power that God manifested in Jesus is at work in you. Those are our lessons. Let's sing our closing hymn.